Welcome to the Stratcompio, the GDG Inspires newsletter that features one interview with one expert and one review of a specific strategic communication related matter per month. My name is Giulia Dino Giacomelli, and I am the founder of GDG Inspire. This month, we have invited Balša Lubarda. He is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the University Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, in Spain. He's an expert in communicating sustainability and working with far-right and other radicalized or marginalized groups. In this interview, we will discuss specifically the role of discourse around climate and environment for extremists around the political spectrum. Balša, welcome to the Stratcompio.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Break the ice of the interview, a very, if you like, general, but at the same time, groundbreaking question that I have for you here. How have extremist groups across ideological spectrums framed climate change and environment in their discourse? So we know that, of course, both the far right and the far left have weaponized climate and environment for, propagating their extremist narratives. Are there distinct rhetorical patterns among the right and left? If you can just give us an overview of where the different groups stand when it comes to climate and environment.
Thank you. I think it's a great question to kind of start the conversation. At the same time, it is a question loaded with certain concepts that, academics are all about unpacking the concepts and engaging with them. I will not do that extensively, I promise, but I think it is, and it may definitely be useful to perhaps set the goalposts for this particular conversation about, ideology, right, left, and especially the climate crisis and climate change as such. We definitely do live in times of crisis, whether it's a poly-crisis that has been continuing for decades and, climate crisis being arguably the most pressing threat to the whole of humanity and non-human actants on this planet, at least. Definitely, that's something that is very difficult to kind of dispute. While obviously there is no single solution to this crisis, it is expected that the solution or the set of solutions will have to entail a significant shift away from the fossil fuels and also the industries based on these fuels. Moreover, this perspective shift is probably, if it ever is to happen, would have to entail a significant change in how we produce and consume. And I think that this move away from fossil fuels being the first and the most important step, even though not an easy one, moving towards the renewables is the first and the most important step, as I said, something that the climate science has well established. And this all may seem relatively straightforward. And as I said, climate science is in fact quite straightforward and relatively unanimous when it comes to or majoritarian when it comes to the diagnosis of the problem and the prescription of the solutions. Yet the governments around the world do not seem to care much about this, right? And instead cracking down on climate activism around the globe. And this crackdown is not only happening in the authoritarian regimes or non-democratic regimes or in those spaces and geographies that we would kind of tend to associate with draconian, harsh, and authoritarian politics, but instead, in some of the world, this is all happening in some of the world's most renowned Western democracies, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and Norway. A recent study, I think it was published by the University of Bristol, has found that the British police arrest environmental protesters at nearly 3 times the global average rate. And this is quite disturbing to know. Why is it that I mentioned this in the first place as a kind of an attempt to set the goalpost? It very much matters. The reason why I kind of wanted to start off with this is that it very much matters on how we define the mainstream responses to climate change, and based on that mainstream, how is it that we define what is radical and what is extremist? Here again, it may be useful to introduce a separation between mainstream and extremism. It would be easy to say extremists use violence, but there are different forms of violence. Extinguishing someone's tire, to kind of use the name of a climate activist group, is not the same as killing a number of people, environmental activists, or people belonging to the fossil fuel industry. It doesn't matter. So the separation is indeed becoming quite blurred. And what I think gets lost in these attempts to set these goalposts is the concept of radicalism. I think that we need more radical solutions. I think that climate crisis has accentuated the need for radical politics, radical solutions, and radical activism as such. And departing from that, we also need to understand these possible radical responses that come from the right and from the left side of the ideological spectrum. Obviously, not all radical responses and not all of radical politics are good. In fact, most of this radical politics spectrum is harmful. But it is kind of also important to understand that we will need, when I say we, I'm thinking of as I said, humanity as a whole will definitely need radical politics to kind of be in a position where we can kind of survive is maybe too harsh of a term, but be in a position to live a more sustainable future. Now to finally get to
yes, can I just jump on that, because it's a fascinating debate. I know that I think personally, I'm not particularly a fan of academic debates, but I think this is really, really interesting because it has direct communication implications. If I understand right, what you are saying is that when we talk about extremism, let's say in general as a field, we talk about radicalization. But if you apply what we commonly think about radicalization in the context of climate extremism, let's say that the same category or the criterion based on which we assess radicalization kind of shift, because the mainstream and the extremism, let's say that even the extremists within the, let's say, in the, within the mainstream, the policies should be kind of more radical about climate to match what science says. And what I think the implication of what you say is considering that the government policies do not follow science, which is kind of unanimous on that, applying a more radical standpoint in policies would actually help us to match evidence with policies. Is that actually what you are trying to say, or am I going too far?
So just to kind of draw a set of very kind of axiomatic conclusions from what I just said and what you commented on. Radicalism is not equal to extremism. If we want to denote extremism as something undesirable, bad, something that we do not want to have in our democratic societies, then radicalization is not, it shouldn't be the target. As I said, not all radicalizations and radicalisms are good. Radicalization can lead to extremism. But I think that there's a need to, even in a conceptual way, especially in a communication, in a communicational sense, to resuscitate, kind of bring back this notion of radicalism to the politics of today, because we need radical politics to push for progressive change, especially in the context of climate crisis. So yes, pretty much when you have governments, even the democratic governments, who are kind of preserving the status quo, which is amplifying. Now it's almost, we're at a level where the damage to the climate is kind of increasing at an exponential rate, I think that radical politics definitely need to become mainstream. Of course, which kind of radical politics, this is something that definitely needs to be debated on. To finally get to the question, the original question that you posed on how this is conceptualized on the right and on the left, I will give a set of very simplistic answers here in an attempt to kind of point to some of the main phenomena. To start from the left, obviously the climate change, climate crisis is seen as an extension of capitalist exploitation, especially arguing that it is the corporations and the elites that drive environmental destruction for profit. Now, I imagine that this interview will also be watched or kind of followed by some of the right wingers, and I think that with this first sentence, not even the right wingers would disagree, meaning that this could be a potential common thread, this anti-capitalist sentiment, anti-consumption sentiment that is actually shared also on the right. Then on the left, there's this emphasis when it comes to the specific tactics, there's an emphasis on direct action, especially ecological sabotage, something that is by and large unpopular on the far right. So we're talking about the Extinction Rebellion, the Last Generation, and other radical climate movements. The Just Stop Oil, as they're viewing these forms of direct action as necessary responses to state inaction. This is not really happening on the right. So another component of the left, radical left climate movements is this emphasis on justice, especially through anti-colonial and, in some circles, anti-growth narratives. So a very strong anti-colonial sentiment, and a very strong justice sentiment. Now, I think that this anti-colonial and anti-justice sentiment, depending on the context, can also be found on the right. And this leads to a lot of confusion and a lot of conflation, especially when it comes to environmental communication. So, seeing climate crisis is the reason to dismantle the Western economic system, Western economic model. And the reason why I said that sometimes these ideas can be a motivating factor for the right. Take, for instance, the degrowth movement, which is, as we all know, heavily associated with left-wing politics. Actually, there is a branch, or these degrowth ideas are occasionally picked up by the far right as well. And I'm not saying by the right intentionally, but by the far right in particular. There's an example of the German ecological magazine, Die Kehre, which is frequently kind of commissioning texts and based on that are engaging with these anti-growth arguments on the far right. These are usually based on the anti-modern and the quasi-pastoral sentiments, narratives of nurturing the land and isolating yourself from, the outer world in an attempt to create a parallel system. So there is a lot of liberty being kind of this value that is quite present. So that brings me to the right wing or the far right ecologism, to be more specific, and which also was the title of the book that I wrote, exploring far right environmental communication. So far right environmental communication is predominantly centered around two main values, depending on the context and on the again particular organization. One value is purity, this idea that nation and nature are an indivisible unity that should be kept pure, whatever that means, right? Pure from immigrants, pure from the LGBTQI communities, pure from anything that they consider not to belong to the domain of natural. And then the second value is what I said, again, kind of borrowed from US right-wing politics, the idea of liberty, the idea of freedom. We saw that with the pandemic. And a lot of climate denial actually is motivated by this idea of freedom. You know, we want to be free. That's why we reject climate policies. We see climate policies as an imposition on our personal freedoms, personal liberties. I want to drive a big truck. Again, I'm being very banal here, and I apologize for that, but in an attempt to clarify, I want to, ride a big truck. This should be my freedom. I worked hard for it. I managed to kind of, get the funds together to buy it. Why am I not allowed to have it? Why should I be taxed additionally to own such a vehicle, and etc., etc. So I think that from these two ideas, a lot of very specific far-right narratives on the environment are derived. And these specific narratives are, as I said, the fear of overpopulation, for instance, that is consequently kind of attached to this nativist sentiment, the naturalism, the idea that nature should be a blueprint for the social laws. We should be looking up to nature to organize our society. The idea that we should be self-dependent, self-sustainable, the principle of autarky, the nostalgia for the good old times and the good old environments. Remember when we had a very small community, the smell of fresh cooked food, etc., etc. I'm not saying that these arguments are not used on the left, but the right gives these kind of ideas a very particular flavor. And again, this idea of home-cooked food means shortening the chain of production. Also, it presumes a gendered division of labor. It was our grandmothers and mothers who were cooking this food, and healthy family that spent a lot of time outdoors, at times even rejecting technology is a part of this far-right ecologist discourse. Then there is a set of these kind of not quasi-localist, but very clearly localist policies, such as I said, circular economy adapted to the far right discourse. You should be consuming the food that was either grown by you or your neighbor, and then a number
And
of
that stems out of the purity kind of.
Yes, indeed, because this is how if it was you who grew I don't know, tomatoes in your backyard, that is how you will know if you use any pesticides or something, anything along the lines, and you do not
Yeah,
have control over
yeah.
this.
But it has to do somehow also with the element of trust, right? So this hyper local kind of dimension of far right ecologism, it has to do also with this element of trust, right? We don't try a kind of anti-establishment somehow.
Very clear populist kind of undertones, and I think that the antitrust element is what arguably transcends ideology. It is highly likely, or it is more likely to be found on the right than on the left. But I'm not saying that the left is immune to this when it comes to environmental discourses. So this idea that you cannot trust the institutions, you cannot trust the institutions to regulate the market when it comes to the food production and food consumption. You cannot trust the labels. You cannot, and this is how you have to kind of create your own parallel system.
Trying to zoom out on that, because I think this is quite relevant. How much of the climate-related discourse intersect with, anti-globalist, anti-elitist, anti-Western rhetoric somehow in the extremist messaging? Are there trends on that you can you can share with us?
When it comes to trends, that the anti-establishment, anti-elite sentiment is what drives most of these especially this belief that climate policies are somehow generated, driven, pushed for by the climate elites or the environmental elites. This is actually a coinage that is quite often used by the far right, but it's not only the far right. Again, we're bringing this back to the issue
Yeah.
of trust. I think the pandemic has especially exacerbated these fears and these sentiments of anti-trust, the lack of trust in the institutions. And a lot of people on the left are also rejecting, and this is why I think that pandemic is possibly being a turning point when it comes to the trends. I indicated this before that in my research, the research that I've done with my colleagues, with Bernhard Fochner, with Louis Dean, now also with Ashton Kingdon and others, we found that there was a very visible shift in the pre-pandemic era on the far right from the outright denial of climate change, arguments such as climate change is a hoax, it's not happening, it has happened before, it's nothing new, it's being blown out of proportion, blah, blah. So a shift from those kinds of arguments to the forms of skepticism or forms of obstruction, which are going along the lines of, yes, climate change is happening, but the policies that are being pushed for by these environmental elites are not the right ones. So it's not good to introduce a carbon tax. It's not good to, I don't know, standardize the pollution levels or the ban the certain standards of motors of car, the vehicles, etc., etc. So kind of going against very particular policy solutions. And I think that this was a very good strategy for the far right, because on the one hand, it helped them move away from this climate denialist aura, which has become counterproductive with the increasing evidence on the reality of the crisis. Climate change definitely is happening. There is ample evidence to support this. But at the same time, it has also helped them frame their own environmentalist profile, so to speak, where they kind of engage in very particular policy discussions on individual environmental issues. And this is where the far right was actually relatively successful in depending again on the case, on the context, on the country, etc. The pandemic, as I said, I think kind of halted this shift towards climate acceptance, or this yes but form of acceptance, because of this lack of trust in the institutions. And I think that it again reinstated the old forms of, we are not going to trust we're not going to trust anything that comes from the institutions, including climate policies. We're not going to believe that, I don't know, ban on single-use plastic is necessary for Germans, Montenegrins, Italians, people from Botswana or wherever, to not to be Eurocentric here. But we actually have to look for ourselves, look for our own, which again brings back this localist sentiment, this essentially skeptical sentiment. And another thing that is unfortunately happening here is it kind of brings back this parochialist tendency. I want to do not tell me what to do in my backyard. We started, you probably most of the listeners or viewers have heard of the NIMBY movements, not in my backyard, which were the some of the early days of climate activism, some of which exist to this day, where local communities would rise up against harmful environmental projects in their vicinity. But I think that the far right is kind of this parochialism has amplified these trends, and even environmental protests are going along the lines of, we do not want something to be in our own backyards, but we don't mind if it is happening elsewhere. We don't mind. We're not interested in creating a universal alliance against these harmful practices, against these extractivist practices, against, you know, crackdowns and climate protests, insofar as this is not happening in our own backyard. So a lot of space for rhetorical maneuvering, which I think the far right has been using quite a bit. Again, the shift that I indicated was predominantly a shift, I believe, in public opinion. And what I notice again over the last 2 or 3 years is that the far right organizations are picking up on that trend. So they're kind of becoming ever more stronger in their climate denialism, or some of the organizations that I never heard have anything to say on the climate issue or the set of issues are now all of a sudden becoming climate denialists, saying, you know, this is irrelevant. This is not something we should even be discussing.
When we discussed about the tension between globalist and localized, the not in my backyard movement and so on and so forth. So the kind of the proximity, you know, as you, I think, as you described it, there is a bit of an elephant in the room, in the sense that, of course, we are increasingly talking about, you know, climate migration, and so which is already a very dear thematic for the far right. But at the same time, what you are saying is they are getting from a full spectrum denial to okay, we acknowledge the fact that climate change is happening, yet we don't like the policies that are being implemented. So how do we reconcile these two things? I mean, can you kind of draw a bit the picture about all these elements and connect the dots for us?
Yes, so it's very difficult to connect the dots because I believe the right and the left, for that matter, quite often has not reconciled or connected these dots themselves. First point that I would like to make when it comes to the relationship between far right and climate-induced migration, it's not as straightforward as you would expect, or as one would expect. When I started my research on these issues, as I said, some 7-8 years ago, I thought that this fear of climate migrants was going to be at the very core of the pro-environmental far-right narratives. So to sum things up, if a far-right organization was ever to be green, it would center most of its discourse around let's not have climate migrants arrive to our home country, because it was kind of a logical link. You know, far-right was immigration was the main topic of the far right, and you would expect that this is how they associate the environment, how they introduce the issue of environment into their broader political appeal. Surprisingly or unsurprisingly enough, I did not see much of that connection. The far right of today does not actually talk much about climate migrants as such. They are sometimes used as a kind of a weapon of, you know, to be wielded to kind of instill fear. You know, if we either it is either the environmental elites that will kind of bring the climate migrants to our home country, or it is the fossil fuel industry. This is especially the case with the most extreme right, the eco-fascist organizations, which are small and irrelevant, who are kind of claiming that if we do not address the fossil fuel industry, we will be having ever more climate migrants in our country. As I said, this is not really happening, and I was quite surprised to see that that wasn't happening. What is happening instead is, on the one hand, there is an attempt, and I'm talking now a bit more about the mainstream right, not necessarily the extreme. There is an attempt to capitalize on these issues, to kind of politically capitalize and economically capitalize on the issue of climate change. So, for instance, climate crisis, this is an excellent opportunity for us to become self-dependent energy-wise. a lot of countries have kind of strengthened this energy autarky discourse. Then again, we should also produce our own food more, grow local food, etc., etc. The far right has always been about this. In fact, there were examples in Hungary and in other countries, I believe, but in Hungary is the one that I recall and that I wrote about in my book, in which the far right and the far left were actually, not the far left, sorry, but the Green Party joined forces on the issue of small-scale agriculture. They were supporting it for completely different reasons, obviously, but the bill was actually the motivation was there. So for the right wing, it was more about the backbone of the nation, the blood and soil rhetoric. Every Hungarian should have his own plot of land, etc., etc. Whereas for the Greens, it was more about organic farming, etc. But it's interesting to see that sometimes these overlaps appear, and oftentimes in response to say outside factors. The pandemic was definitely one of them. It was indeed during the pandemic that a lot of far-right organizations were kind of advocating for growing your home, your own food. Which makes all kinds of sense, and there's nothing far right about this, in and of itself. But there was a tendency to give it give this far right flavor. Now there is a very why I said there it is very difficult to connect the dots, especially on the right, because there's this, on the one hand, there's this tendency to climate change really is an elephant in the room in and of itself as a topic, because you either reject this altogether, but you're saying, yes, we think climate is not an issue that anyone should deal with, but we want to protect the environment. No single organization will say we're not for environmental protection. Even if you're a non-party actor, you still want to protect the environment. Obviously, everyone wants to do that. That's an example of a balance issue in politics. So there's this sentiment, and how, like, if you're anti-climate, if you're a climate denialist, how is it that you're going to frame your pro-environmental agenda? And that is very difficult. On the other hand, if you are acknowledging the existence of climate change, I think that gives you a lot more leverage to push for your own flavor, your own brand of environmentalism. And in that case, it is again more about, it is first and foremost about autarky and liberty, the idea of the nation being free to consume its own and to produce its own produced. But at the same time, there's another problem, which is the populist principle, people first. Because if the people are first, then you probably want to push for more imports, globalization. You cannot reject globalization if you're pro people, because that will definitely mean higher costs, in the current things. So this is another issue that the kind of far-right ecologists around the world are trying to wrap their head around. And whenever they try to present an articulate program, it falls short on explaining on how is it that you actually deal with these types of problems. If we're talking about the left, not to be talking about the right too much now, if we're talking about the left, it seems like a very clear idea of how climate change should be addressed. So it's a very clear anti-capitalist sentiment. Okay, tick. Point number two, we also want to scale down the production and the consumption. Okay, could be ticked relatively. But then again, what is the role of the state? For eco-socialists, it's not the same as for the social ecologists or for the degrowthers. I'm not going to delve into these specific scholarly debates, but are we, is degrowth really a solution? Are the small-scale communities really a solution, or should we have a strong state, as as it goes usually with eco-socialists, that is going to kind of manage this green transition in the right way. Is the strong state our only hope against the corporations, against the elite? So there's a lack of clarity there as well. And I think that lack of clarity is ultimately contributing to these cracks, these little cracks that are unfortunately leading to some of the left environmentalist movements being recognized as extremist.
If I understand, I mean, just to let's say recap, I think you made two very interesting points here. So that on the one hand, both the far left and the far right do have inconsistencies in their messaging when it comes to reconciling their positioning on environment. On the other hand, I think what they are struggling with in different terms and with different constraints is about the governance. So what we were saying before in terms of the far right, so this hyper-local, perspective, but at the same time, if it's people first, then you cannot be fully anti-globalization. Whereas on the far left is rather on how do we interpret socialism within an environment-friendly, let's say, policy setting.
Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of sum up what you were saying?
Yes, and I would say, I mean, just one thing that I would like to add is that these inconsistencies that I mentioned, they're present all over the ideological spectrum. So it's not only about the far right and the far left. They're just the topic of today's conversation. But we're talking about, if we're thinking about liberal environmentalism, whatever that means, today,
Yeah.
the mainstream environmentalism, if we are going to put an equation mark between the two, it has a number of these inconsistencies as well. This belief that you're leaving it up to the the free market conservative ecologism. Each of these, even the ecofeminism as such, has a number of these internal inconsistencies that are ultimately preventing it from becoming a major political force, at least in the environmental domain. But you rightly mentioned, and I think that you put it more clearly than I kind of managed to. I think the position of the state in this future environmental polity as such is heavily debated in the far right and far left circles. And like how, to what extent the state cannot be impartial. The far right nor the far left are up for that. The impartiality of the state, which is a central liberal principle, is something that is out of the window for right-leaning and left-leaning ecologists. But at the same time, how is this balance to be created? Because if the state is going to be ever stronger, that means higher taxes, most likely, if we are to have a green transition, and that the higher taxes goes against the principle of liberty again. And these are the issues that are, as I'm quite sure that anyone who will be listening to this conversation will recognize, these issues exist well outside of the environmental or climate domain. These are broader ideological issues. But I think that this right-wing influence from the US has especially affected the way in which the right wing in Europe thinks about the environment as well. This idea of liberty. It also affects it in a possibly, we could, discuss whether this is a positive or a negative outcome. But I did one of the research projects that I was a part of, that actually led as a PI, was exploring what kind of framings are going to be appealing to right-wing voters. And what we saw is that it was an experimental research, and to kind of sum things up, our finding was that if you frame an issue on like investing in renewables as an investment in your personal liberty down the road, liberty from the grid. You know, if I'm building solar panels, if I want to construct solar panels at my own home or in my own building, that means that I will be more independent a few years down the road. If you frame the message in such a way, it is highly likely to be appealing to right-wing voters as compared to non-right voters. And I think that that is the influence of the right-wing values from the U.S. because this U.S. right, as we know, is heavily libertarian and heavily based on the freedom from the taxation system. We do not want to be taxed. Why would the government interfere with my way of life? And this is not something that Europe as a whole, again, I'm generalizing here, but speaking, European societies are necessarily kind of, this is not the mainstream in Europe, or it wasn't.
No.
But it is becoming. And this could be an indicator of also how some pro-environmental policies from the right may look like in the future. And they've already looked like, the far right around the world is more than happy to endorse this installing solar panels. This is a way to generate your own electricity, to reduce your costs. Why not?
Yeah, but it's interesting, for example, how it changes when instead of solar panels are actually wind plants, because that has an impact on nature, which is different. I mean, visually speaking. So solar panels would be okay, but wind farms would not be.
Yes, I mean there is a very visible opposition to wind energy in a number of countries in the far right, on the far right. But that's also interesting because, like, if you think about it, for a wind farm to be developed, first of all, the location matters quite a bit. Whether there's going to be any displacement, who is going to live nearby. And I think that these aesthetic kinds of arguments, while they were quite emblematic of the far right, we do not want the wind farms to pollute our beautiful countryside, or we do not want the wind farms to kill our birds, or something along those lines. I think that this was quite ephemeral. This was quite short-lived or irrelevant overall in the argumentation of the far right opposition to wind farms. It is more often than not on whose land this was built, who is it that owns this, who is it that kind of facilitates this process, and how many trees we had to cut for these to be built, or what else could have we done with that land? Was there something else that we could have done with it? If it's an arable land, then there's going to be more opposition on the far right as well. So these are, I think, the arguments that are more pressing than the aesthetic ones, which were, as I said, very interesting and very kind of telling from the far right, but they were not really that central, or they're not likely to be the major kind of cause to be against a wind farm project.
You mentioned before, and this is going to be my last question, but you mentioned before the impacts of the US rhetoric on European audiences and European groups. Of course, US President Trump has announced the withdrawal of the US from the Paris agreements, for example. Question is how extremist groups in general are adapting their messaging, their climate-related messaging, to in response to this mainstream kind of political and geopolitical shifts.
Well, to use a bit of this previous topic, the wind farms, to use the metaphor from part of that topic, it gives them it gives wind to their sails. What Trump did is it's not the first time that Trump is the president of the US. This does not mean that his second presidency is any less dangerous for the state of democracy and for the way in which we deal collectively with the climate crisis and with its consequences. But I definitely think that there is some encouragement for these climate denialist sentiments around the world. And I'm quite sure that this will affect the way in which political parties, far-right political parties especially, engage with this issue, meaning that they will engage in a more denialist way. This is what I would expect. The reality is, I mean, we'll see, but I would also think that what is more likely to happen is that the far right is just not going to engage as much with the topic as it may have been prior to the pandemic and prior to Trump's presidency, in the sense of the far right is kind of starting to recognize, as I said, this was a part of our previous research, starting to recognize that an openly denialist position is not necessarily paying off. So the best way to engage with climate is to avoid it, right? Depending on the country, on the electoral and on the electoral cycle and the pressing debates. For instance, if you're far right in Poland, it's pretty much unimaginable to develop a platform that is going to be pro-climate or developing more progressive climate policy. This is simply not going to happen. But what you could do in theory, as I said, is avoid climate and focus on other environmental issues that are pretty much related to climate. So focus on air pollution, focus on water, soil degradation, focus on noise pollution as well, focus on issues such as agriculture, how to strengthen the farmer as the backbone, etc., etc. So I think that these are the trends are pretty much going to continue. It's not going to be anything fundamentally different. What is, as I said, what is unfortunately going to be more strengthened are these openly denialist positions. So in the years to come, I do not expect to see the far right climate obstruction is going to continue. I do not expect to see some radically progressive green parties on the right. And even if they are progressive, I don't think they're going to fare up well in the elections. But at the same time, I think that the trend of the far right attempting to engage with individual isolated environmental issues will continue because they have to. This is something that is definitely affecting the people that they're claiming to defend and stand up for. So they have to address this. They have to say something on the issue.
Yeah, I mean, also because with more and more climate crisis that we are experiencing in Europe, fires, floods, if their focus is about the people and people first, then there is really little maneuver then to deal with that somehow.
This is another excellent example. I'm thankful that you mentioned this. Focusing, this is the problem with environmental discourse as such, with climate discourse in particular, climate adaptation and mitigation. What does that even mean? It's sometimes very difficult to explain that to someone who's outside of these policy circles. But indeed, the far right will focus more on the specific, say, climate adaptation policies. They're not interested in, mitigation per se, but climate adaptation, if there was a extreme weather event, and there will be plenty, and there has been, the far right is the first in line to call for helping those families who are affected by severe droughts or wildfires or whatnot. So they are usually the first ones to call for establishing funds or to invest more money or to put more money into these funds to kind of help the victims of these extreme weather events. They're not dealing with the cause; they're dealing with the consequences. And I actually think that this is going to continue in the years to come.
Thanks a lot for sharing your insight with us. Before we say goodbye to each other, I have one request for you. If you can share with our readers and followers recommendations for books, videos, podcasts, whatever you feel is relevant to integrate what we have discussed today and might be useful to consume, talking about environment.
Yes, I mean, most of the works I would probably suggest are going to be academic ones. So yeah, this may be a less interesting part of the conversation for those who are not necessarily into those sources. But when it comes to the relationship between the far right and the climate, definitely recommend reading a couple of recent volumes on the issue, not to mention my works, the works of Bernhard Fortune, especially on visual communication and the far right, visual environmental communication of the far right. The book was published last year by Manchester University Press. It's an interesting and quite thought-provoking volume on how the far right uses visuals to promote some of these arguments. Then if you really want to understand how this happens in most of the Western world, I would highly recommend Climate Change in the Far Right, the book by Moore and Roberts, which was published in 2022. I think that speaking more on the left side of the spectrum and the potential solutions against the crisis by Ståle Holgersen is an excellent resource, an excellent book to familiarize yourselves with. And then I'm not really a podcast guy, so I cannot really recommend some excellent podcasts as such, but I would actually suggest that one of the books that should be helpful in understanding these problems with radicalization and extremism, the conceptual issues, is the book by Nixon called Slow Violence. It was published some 10 years ago, but I think it is still highly topical because it explains very well on how we are kind of deaf. Again, we collectively speaking, as governments and systems are deaf to the slow that death usually kind of brought by the climate change and the environmental issues. This is not always a very clear, visible, pressing threat. It is a slow killer, and as such, it is a part of the system that we have collectively constructed, the slow violence system. And I think as such, it is an excellent resource for someone to be kind of familiar with. And then final recommendation on the climate end of things and political parties, a recent book on climate obstruction by Miriam Gruber on the far right in different European countries, how they've used different climate obstruction techniques. This is something that I would also very much recommend. And I think it is an excellent overview on how exactly the far right, what is it that they do on the climate issue. And with that, I would end. Again, unfortunately, all of these are scholarly books, but they're books, and I think they're very easy to read, which is not something you would normally expect from the academic works, right?
Thanks a lot again for your time. It's been a really nourishing conversation, and see you soon on the screen.
Thank you. Thank you very much.